Okay, for this problem, we're graphing the greatest integer of the opposite of x. So the first thing I want to do is remember what the greatest integer of x function looks like. Remember, that's kind of like just a rounding down function where everything between 0 and 1 rounds down to 0, everything between 1 and 2 rounds down to 1, etc. So we end up with these little steps that look like this. So that is the greatest integer function. So what we're expecting for the function that we're graphing this time is some kind of variation on that. It will look similar, but not exactly the same. So what I thought we could do is choose some different x values and then find the y values for them. So suppose x is 1.3. The opposite of that is negative 1.3. And the greatest integer of that, when you round down to the next lower integer, would be negative 2. Let's say we had 1.9. The greatest integer, or the opposite of that, is negative 1.9, and the greatest integer is negative 2. So anything that falls between 1 and 2 is probably going to fall in that category. Let's see what happens to 1. The opposite of 1 is negative 1, and the greatest integer is negative 1. What happens to 2? The opposite is negative 2, and the greatest integer is negative 2. So let's start by plotting those points. If x is 1.3, we get negative 2. If x is 1.9, we get negative 2. If x is 1, we get negative 1. If x is 2, we get negative 2. So we're looking at something like this. Now let's go ahead and try a couple more numbers just to get the pattern. So suppose x is 0.5. The opposite is negative 0.5. And the greatest integer would be the integer below that, so that would be negative 1. So we can plot that point, 0.5, negative 1. Suppose x is 0. The opposite is 0, and the greatest integer would be 0. So we're going to have steps that look like this. And there's our graph. Okay, we also want to give the domain and range. So for the domain, you can put any real number in there. Any real number, you can take the opposite, you can find its greatest integer value. So the domain is negative infinity to infinity. Now for the range, the outputs are only those integer values. We have points at a height of 1, we have points at a height of 0, we have points at a height of negative 1, we have points at a height of any integer value we choose. So we can write ... negative 3, negative 2, negative 1, 0, 1, 2, etc. And that's how we can describe the range. Those are the integer values.